Okay, so now it's time to start using Entity Framework for our app to talk to our database. So we're going to open up my departments page. We've put our grid on. We've put our grid on, but nothing's here so after making all those changes, actually I'm going to go to Visual Studio, I'm going to build my solution, recompile it now that we've used Entity Framework to generate all of those business classes. We won't see any changes really here. When I click on departments, I'm still going to get an empty grid. Right? Nothing's really happening here. So what we want to do is add some code that runs when this page loads that will use the Entity Framework to query the database, get our list of departments, and fill them into our grid. So I'm going to click on the View menu and Code. So I'm going to write my own method that will get the departments, and then when the page loads, we'll call our method. So we haven't written our own methods. By default, we'll make them protected, meaning visible on this page. And notice our page load also has void. That just means our method doesn't return any data. It's just a function that runs. It doesn't send any data back out. And I'm going to call this get departments. With two brackets, two round brackets, meaning nothing's in here, so no, we don't have to supply any parameters or information to this method. And then I'll add a set of curly brackets, so all of the code for this function has to live in here. So we'll use Entity Framework to connect and get the list of departments. That'll be step one. So we no longer have to write our connection. When we use the Entity Framework wizard, it added a connection string section to web.config. It took the name we used, which was default connection, and it said it was using our model file, some of the stuff that got auto-generated. It's using SQL client, meaning our database is SQL server. And then it's got our host, our database name, our username, password. All that stuff is already in here. So I'm going to use the command, C# command using. I have to do one thing first, sorry. Before we can connect, we need to add one reference up at the top. So we'll add a reference so we can use EF for our database. So what I want to list, so whatever you've called the name of your project, my project is COMP2084_lesson8. After I type that and I hit the dot, I should get models. Meaning all of this stuff that Entity Framework built out, we want it to be available in our page. So we need to make a reference to that. So we're basically going to have that line of code on all of our pages, because almost all of our pages are going to interact with our Entity Framework model. So Entity Framework, really think about it, just like in the diagram, it's really a bridge. We have our .NET app, we have our SQL Server database, and Entity Framework is the bridge in between them. So now that I have that reference, if I start typing DEF, it'll bring up my default connection. And I'll call it DB equals new default connection. That's a lot simpler than how we would connect in PHP. We're creating a new default connection, which is in our web.config, and we'll call it DB. We could call it con, doesn't really matter. So this connects to the database for us, And by using it, putting in the using statement with these brackets, it means once this code gets outside of this bracket, Entity Framework will automatically disconnect. So in PHP, we would have to manually add con equals null to disconnect. By putting it in a using statement, as soon as we're done using DB, using our database connection, it will drop automatically. So I'm just going to create a variable, no type. I'll call it deps, standing for departments. And this is where we're going to write our simple link query instead of our SQL query that will select everything. Here's our syntax. From, and I'll just create a variable called D to represent our departments. And notice when I type DB and dot, this brings up a list of all of the models in our database. So we've got departments, enrollments, courses, students. So we want to query our DB departments. That's all we need to do for our query. So instead of a full SQL command, we're using this link sort of query shorthand, in effect. I know that it's new. You've never seen it before. It'll take a little while to get used to. It's actually simpler than writing our full-on SQL commands. So this will store the results of our query, our 3 columns and our 4 rows, in a variable called, I'm just calling it deps as a short for departments. So now we want to bind the deps query result to our grid. This is way, way easier. We don't need a loop. We don't need to go around each column at a time. We have our grid called grid departments. Our grid is an object, and it has a property called data source. Where does the data from the grid come from? Our query result, and we're just going to convert it to a list, which is a built-in C# function. And then our grid also has a method we need to call, set the data source property and call the data bind method. This will automatically populate the grid with all of our data. We don't need a loop like we did, and we don't have to specify each column manually. The nice thing about this syntax is not only is it shorter, we don't have to loop, but we also use it for populating any kind of list. So let's say we want to fill a department's drop-down list. We would use these same 2 lines. Set the data source and call data bind. Or a checkbox list, radio button list. We use the same code for filling any of those from a query. The last thing we have to do when our page loads, how will we connect these up? I can build this right now, but if I run my page, nothing's going to happen. I've added the code. I can compile without errors, yet I still don't have a list of departments. So how do we connect this method and this one up? Because right now this one, our code is here, but it never actually gets executed. What should we do here so that this function will run? Albert? Yeah, so let's call remember, our code in an ASP.NET application, it's not procedural. It doesn't run one line at a time. Functions only run if we call them or if a user does something to call them. So we just call get departments. So when our page loads, we could have put this code right in page load, but it's a little cleaner. It's its own function with a specific purpose. So now if we recompile and run our page, we should get a grid that will hold all our data. So I'll just refresh here, and we'll see what our grid view generates. So it auto-generates that grid. We've applied the bootstrap class so it gets alternating rows, and it's got this hover effect, which is a little hard for you to see. Now we can customize this. In fact, we want to customize this. What things would you recommend we do with this grid? How would we change it if this was going to be a production level application? I'd suggest there's a few things we'd want to do with it. We could add sorting, yep. That's a bit more involved. We'll get there in a few weeks. We won't do it today. How else would you make this grid better? I'd suggest there's one or two changes we might make in the first column. What might we do it? Okay, so yeah, we could change the width. What else might you do with this first column?
I want to say hide it, but I still think.
Okay, well, we could hide it. In fact, we will hide it. What else could we do with it?
Change the name.
Yeah, we might also change the name. What might be a better name? We could call it ID, or we might at least want to put a space in. So the grid by default will automatically show all the columns, but if we want to customize them, we'll put the columns in manually instead in our HTML. So our grid, I'll go back to my departments page. Go back to the HTML. So by default, our grid is set to automatically show the columns. We're going to turn that off. So there's a property here called AutoGenerate Columns. I'm going to change that to false, meaning don't automatically generate the columns with their names from the database. We're going to customize them a little bit. So if I do this and refresh, I actually get nothing. So now what I want to add in here is a columns tag in between my opening and closing grid view.
Need that run at server on the columns?
No, because it's part of the grid. The grid has run at server. So these are all the different kinds of columns we can put in a grid. The main one we're going to use is an ASP Bound field. That just means a column that comes from a query. But we also can put in things like columns that have checkboxes, or links, which we'll use, or images, or other things. So we're going to put in an ASP Bound field. We'll set the data field to department ID. So that means what column in the database are we showing here? But I'm going to set the header text to department ID with a space in it. So if we want to customize the header, we're not going to be able to use the auto-generate columns. We're going to want to use a bound field instead. If I refresh now, we'll get the department ID column only. But we've now put a space in the header. Or if we wanted to call it, as Albert suggested, ID, which would also make it narrower, because the heading's not so long, we could just make the text ID. We'll put in a second bound field for the name. So now we've got two columns. Now here's one place where ASP.NET's very different from PHP. Let's say I call this department name. I specify that as my data field. What do you think is going to happen when I save and refresh? What will appear in that second column? Because the column in my database is called name. It's not called department name. Right. If this was PHP, what would happen when I did it this way? Nope. What would happen in PHP if you misnamed one of the columns? Yeah, you just get blanks. Our page would load, but there'd be no values. So we wouldn't know that we've misnamed it. In .NET, we have to get the names exactly right. Now, they're not case sensitive, but it says there is no property called department name in your query. So that's going to crash when we try to bind the grid. It's not case sensitive, though. For example, if I put in name in lowercase, even though in my database name has a capital N, this is okay. .NET's okay with that. So it's not case sensitive, but the name has to match exactly other than the case. So now we can put the budget back in. So we'll get our budget back in here. But I would suggest, what should we do with the budget for formatting purposes? Budget doesn't look great. What should we do in terms of displaying those budget values? Yeah, we should format them as currency. Again, when we use the AutoGenerate columns, we have no control over formatting. When we specify the columns individually, we have the ability to format. So there's another property here for this. In my budget column, there's a data, if I just type D and hit tab, data format string equals, to format it as currency, I think our format is 0:C, lowercase c. That's a regular expression in .NET. I think we used it when we did our tip calculator. A few weeks ago, we applied that currency formatting. If I refresh now we're also formatted as currency. So the grid's totally customizable. Brandon, if we don't want that column, or let's say we want the ID here, but we don't want to show it to the user, we could set visible to false on our department ID. So that value's still there, so the server can still keep track of those IDs if, let's say, we want to delete one. But we've turned that column invisible at runtime in the HTML. So if we think that's a value users shouldn't see, we can still put it there if we need it, like for an edit or delete link, but users won't actually see it. Bless you. It's allergy season.
Allergy season.
'Tis the season. I'm in July now. It's July now, so I'm good. For me, it starts June 1, ends June 30th. Okay. So if we wanted to then build out courses or students, pretty easy. We'll just put on a grid view. We'll put on the columns we want, and our code to populate it is really almost identical to here, except instead of using departments, we could use courses or enrollments or students and show those columns instead. Question?
I'm suddenly getting an error with the data bind.
What does the error say?
It is format exception if the string is not in the correct format. I have no idea where that's coming from now.
Was that once you added the data format string?
Yeah.
Okay, so something wrong here. Make sure you did that. That's exactly what I have. Matt, I'm going to come back to your point because you mentioned sorting with the grid. These grids have a lot of functionality. So among the functionality that are built right into it are the ability to do sorting. We have to add a bit of code, but the grid, if I look at some of the properties, here's a property, allow sorting, right? So we can turn that on. It also has paging. So if we want to allow, so paging is when we let the users choose how many records they want to see at once. Okay, so commonly used in something like, if I went here, right? Yeah, so we can let the user see how many records at a time. It's really great. Wow. Okay, we need to shop somewhere else. Let's shop for, I don't know, what are we shopping for?
Shoes.
What kind of shoes?
Nike. Nope.
Do they give us the option to see? Nope, they don't give us the option. Okay, we need to shop somewhere else. Where else can we shop?
Amazon.
What are we looking for? We need a dishwasher. Right? So here's the paging. Show me 40, show me 80, show me 200 per page. Right? So we can give people, we can either set the page size ourselves, but depending on the application, we might give the user a choice, links or a drop-down that would let them set how big our grid should be. So we can easily do that. Our grid has properties like allow paging. It has a property called page size where we can set and we can change that dynamically if we want to. We'll look at doing that in a few weeks. Actually, you know what? We can do the paging right now. The paging's easy. We got a few minutes. Let's enable paging. Right now there's only 4 records, but we can set the page size to 1, 2, 3, or 4. So in my grid, let's add allow paging. We'll set it to true. And let's set the default page size to 2. So it will show 2 departments at a time in the grid. I know that's not very realistic, but we only have 4 records. So we'll set page size equal to 2. And now what we need is we need an event, a method, so that when the user clicks on one of the page numbers, it will do the paging. So that event, if I type on page index changing equals, and I'll choose create new event. And that will write a page index change method in our code. So we'll just add those 3 properties in blue to our grid. Okay. So now Visual Studio writes a page index changing. So we just need a couple of lines of code. So we'll set the new page index and repopulate the grid. So what we want to do is set the page index. That just means the current page number. gets or sets the index of the currently displayed page equals E dot new page index. So E represents the page number. Visual Studio will build links with our page numbers. And when we click one of those, the E will tell us which link the user clicked. And now we'll call get departments again. We'll try it like this. I think we're going to have to add one more line of code, but we'll see what this gives us. So I'm going to build my solution. And when I go back, we should only see the first two departments. So I'll click on departments now. So notice it only shows me two. I didn't add these. Just by saying allow sorting, allow paging, Visual Studio automatically figures out and it gives me these links. So when I click 2, well, actually it's working fine. Right? So I can go back. English, math. So if we wanted to, we could give the user a little drop down. We'll maybe do that next week. We could give them a drop down saying how many records per page. And when they click it, we could give them an option like 2, 4, 10. And we can dynamically set the page size of our grid. So that's quite a bit of functionality that's baked right in. We don't really have to code all that stuff manually. Microsoft was smart enough to know if we wanted a grid of data, chances are people are going to want to be able to sort it. They're going to want to be able to page through it if there's a lot of records. So I think this is probably a good place for us to stop for the day. So where are we going next week? Next week when you come into class, what we're going to do, we're going to take this solution. I'm going to put it up on GitHub. I'll just put the link on Blackboard. We're going to take this week's file. We'll export it as a template. And then we'll create a new solution for next week. What we want to build is we want to build an add department page where we can add to this list. And then we'll want to add edit and delete functionality as well. We should be able to get all of that done next week. And then I'm going to give you a lab. Basically, for your lab, you're going to build out. So by the end of next week, we're going to have departments fully working. We can add, we can edit, we can delete, we can get a list. Your lab will be to take what we've done on departments and do it for students. So you'll do create, read, update, and delete for the students page. So you'll do that at home for lab 2. Okay?
Is the lab next week or this week?
Yeah, next week. Give it to you next week because we've only done the read part. We'll do the create, update, and delete next week, working with departments, and then you'll get to practice with students. And then we'll move on to courses in 2 weeks because then we've got related data because courses are related to departments. So we'll have to look at how does Entity Framework handle those relationships. Okay, so I will post